Hey everyone, welcome back to another podcast of the Neural Medwork. We're really excited today to have Dr. Zaahir Moloo from Scribeberry join us. As you might know, the ambient AI space is a space that a lot of clinicians are talking about. It's one of the most prominent AI tools in healthcare that we're seeing being utilized right now. And Scribeberry is definitely one of the top three tools that we see in the Canadian marketplace. And so, we're really excited about this conversation with Isa here today. And I guess the best place to start would be to tell us a little bit about your journey. I know you're a family doc out of Edmonton, but what got you into this space and what led to the creation of Scribeberry?
Thanks for the intro. I guess to start off with, so my name is Zaahir Mooloo. I'm a family doc in Edmonton. I do some mental health work as well. Specific to Scribeberry, really, from a young age, I've had kind of an interest in tech, and whether it's video games or kind of computer programs in general. But that interest has been there for a long time. And then, just kind of being in the medical space, going through residency, personally experiencing a lot of burnout early in my practice. It kind of pushed me towards creating something that could be, a solution. And I think early on in my practice, I had a patient panel of 1,800 patients, semi-rural. A lot of documentation burden, a lot of tasks, writing notes, letters. And so when the pandemic hit, interests kind of shifted a bit, and that kind of pushed me to create a very rudimentary no-code version of Scribeberry. And then things kind of grew from there.
Was there a point in your clinical practice where you really felt like, something needs to change? We hear about this all the time in the media now that burnout rates in healthcare are over 50%, 60%, depending on what survey you look at, and especially in family medicine, as you're talking about, it's definitely something that we see all the time. Was there kind of a moment that made you feel like I need something to change? Was it something that kind of built up over time? And how did you get started, to actually form a company? Because a lot of physicians we talk to say, we see problems, but like, how do you go from that step of saying, I see a problem, I want to fix it, and what are the next steps to actually get to starting a company?
Yeah, I think there definitely, so it was a gradual build up initially, I would say. My first 2 years of practice, I think first off, everyone said, don't start a patient panel right away, locum. And I didn't take that advice. I just started a panel and in a busy place as well. And the clinic I was at was fantastic, right? Like they were supportive. Nothing really they could have done better. I think over time, though, it's just the gradual kind of buildup of demands on you. Um, it just added up. And I think the breaking point really was the pandemic. And so when that hit, understandably, patients, wanted more and were struggling themselves. And then on top of that, you had the burden on yourself as a physician. Also starting a young family at that time. So I think that was the catalyst that really, okay, I got to walk away, from this panel I have, change the style of practice that I have. So that was on that first question. But in terms of actually building out a tool, it honestly was a hobby initially. So, kind of at nighttime when my wife's sleeping, the kids are asleep, I would sort of, muck around with some no-code tools. And eventually, it took a little bit of time, and I hacked together this really rudimentary no-code version. And as I started using it, I thought, okay, like this is working well. And at that time, it didn't actually have the AI scribe component. It was completely different. Like it had the ability to organize some notes and kind of write things for you. But that was the starting point. That was kind of what, started. And then turning that into a company, when I started to see the benefit of it, I thought, why not give it a try? And Aman, my co-founder, and I have been friends for a long time. He's in the software world. He's been there for like 15 years. And so we got together and kind of built it out. Yeah.
And at that time, would you say that you had seen other tools? I mean, today when we look at the ambient health AI scribe space, you can see over 40 or 50 tools that,
Yeah.
really big international companies and smaller companies. Had you explored any of those before, or was it kind of a time and space where you hadn't really been exposed to that and really jumped in because of the clinical need you saw yourself?
Yeah, we were actually quite early on. Um, when we launched, like none of the other, like it was in that very early adoption phase. Definitely weren't like 50 or 60 other tools around. There might have been one or two. Um, so yeah, it was kind of good timing, I guess you could say, in a way. But certainly, yeah, the last year we've seen an explosion of these tools. And many of them, do a great job too. But yeah, we've just tried to be as organic as we can be to kind of the physician workflow, and augment that in the best way possible. So that's been our, go-to is how do we solve problems? A lot of other companies, will focus more on the business aspect. For example, right now, maybe integrations. Whenever we have investors talk to us, the first thing they mention is integrations. From our end, that's important, but that's not priority number one. Because from a physician workflow perspective, there's a lot more important things that could be solved before you do that. Of course, it's all important, but that's just to kind of give you an idea. So, yeah.
Um, Quick question: who was your first customer, and how did you land that customer, and what was the like his or her reaction to the first prototype?
Yeah. So, how we launched is kind of organic. So, what we did, we put out a free version, right? Just to kind of see, is there any interest in this thing? And again, at that time, there was no AI scribe component. It was just purely like take notes and make them better or write your stuff for you. Um, Very simple. So when we put that out, we posted in a Facebook group and said, "Hey, here's a tool, I've made a physician Facebook group," and then people started using it. And so at that point, like in that first week, we were overwhelmed. I can't remember how many users we got, but it was crazy. And so we said, okay, we should monetize this and kind of switch.
The
Um,
chat GPT moment.
yeah, and so that's kind of when we decided, okay, let's kind of gate this, monetize it a bit. And initially we started at like $39 a month, which is quite low pricing wise. And then yeah, just because of the demand, we had to increase it and kind of, eventually find our sweet spot. But that's kind of how we got our first customer. Um, yeah.
Wow. I mean, I think most people that are kind of in tune at all with anything healthcare and AI, when it comes to clinical tools that people are talking about and actually using at the bedside today, like ambient health scribes are probably the top one or two in the space. So can you just tell our listeners a little bit about what ambient AI scribes are? Because I think, when I talk to clinicians, sometimes they're still not really understanding of what it means to have an ambient AI scribe. And like, how do you describe it to clients and people when you're describing Scribeberry? What does it actually do?
Yeah, so we could define it as kind of a device of some kind that will listen to a conversation for you and automatically note take that conversation in a format that you'd like. So this could be soap notes, this could be consult letters, this could be, referrals, this could be patient handouts. Essentially, you take audio, turn it into organized text. Um, and that's a very simplistic explanation in terms of workflow, but that's kind of very basic, bare bones. Yeah.
And why do you think these tools have like really exploded in the AI healthcare space in the last year or year and a half? Is there like a moment where the adoption really took off in terms of what you guys saw? Because it sounds like you had quite an explosion of interest when you first launched, and then was there a plateau after that, and then another big level of interest?
So month to month, we've kind of grown. Our growth rate, has stayed fairly consistent, and it's mostly been word of mouth, right? So that's been the main catalyst. I would say we're still in the early adoption phase. I don't think we're at a point where we reach like critical mass, just as an industry as a whole. And despite that, the popularity of this is only rising. I think, the proof is in the data. I mean, there's published research now that kind of shows the benefit of these. In our own research too, we've seen physicians save at least 1 to 2 hours a day. And if you turn that into, just dollars, forget time, which is even more valuable, I think, but just dollars, right? These things kind of increase your income, pay for themselves. And then, yeah, save you time. That's valuable. Um, there was, a global news media kind of segment that aired, and the physician in that video said, this was the first Christmas in decades that she's actually been able to put her computer away and not do her notes. Like, so these things I think spread organically, and I think that's really the main driver of growth. Yeah.
If you were in your own words, so I mean, you've been doing this for some time now. Um, if you're talking to a clinician, what are kind of the three big benefits of using a tool like Scribeberry in the clinical practice? Like, what should they expect to see on the first day that they're using it, the first week that they're using it, in terms of expectations that you set for these early adopters and people that are starting to really join this
Yeah.
wave of users?
So I think there's two parts to that. The first is, that first day, you probably will need time to get used to it. And I think because it's a novel technology and medicine in general is very slow to adapt technology. Like we still use fax machines, right? In Alberta anyways. Um,
Yeah,
so
same here.
day one, probably a bit of learning, playing around, trying it out. And then that first clinic day, once they're kind of used to using it, yeah, you'd save time, you'd reduce your documentation burden, and probably increase your income in the long run. So, and those are kind of three key points, right? And on a broader scale, if you're preventing the burnout of physicians from their clinics, you're probably going to see benefits, at a patient level and a government level as well. So that's there as well.
Yeah. So I want to sort of get into that space a little bit more about government policy and then also like physician unburden, right? Because it's a very important topic right now. And we know that we're in a healthcare crisis. And, the solution is probably to free those physicians from those times that they don't like to spend on.
For sure.
But I hear a lot of people talking about how the Canadian system or incentives are not aligned, especially from the government policy level. And then also from like the physician's own perspective, like there are conflicts of incentives and stuff like that. What do you think needs to happen? Or first of all, do you think that's a thing? Do you think we're just going to naturally change into a better healthcare system with all this technology? Or if not, what do you think needs to happen in terms of, adoption or healthcare transformation that could really drive this innovation and, have those actual like impacts on like national level? What's your view on
Yeah.
that?
So first off, like I think our system in general is heading more towards crisis than any kind of solution, irrespective of whether tech is there or not. And I think there's numerous factors for that, right? You have an aging population, you have doctors who are overworked and undervalued. You have patients who demand more, and rightfully so. They're living in a kind of a different time than, let's say, their parents, or and yeah, you have reduced kind of funding and dollars available as well. And then inflation, economic pressures. I think these are like the major challenges that shape, the healthcare system in general, not so much like the tech, right? Like the inventions are great. The regulation around that, will continue and change and evolve. But I think that's going to be a small drop in the bucket relative to all the other problems that the healthcare system faces. With that being said, if you have a tool like this, in our survey, for example, 37% of users we surveyed actually indicated they'd be willing to see more patients if they had access to a tool like this. So if you have a third of respondents, right? Let's say a third of doctors who take on more patients. Yeah, that'll fill a gap. It'll be a short-term solution. Will it help in the long term? I don't know. Um, I think, and this is maybe as an aside, I think in general, governments are more like short-sighted in their policies across, the political spectrum. Oftentimes they think in election cycles and 4-year chunks or 2-year chunks, and really it's very discordant. It switches back and forth. I think until that almost communication issue and policy issue is kind of fixed, can it be fixed? I don't know. I think, yeah, we're probably heading more towards crisis. And maybe I'm a pessimist, but that's it's kind of how I see it as a burned out doc who's been through the system. So, yeah.
Just following up on that, because I agree with you that there's problems that's just out of our control,
Yeah.
and that needs to be fixed. But but some optimistic ideas surrounding large systems, sort of healthcare systems. It could be like provisional level, or it could be just one big hospital, right? That starts adopting innovative solutions. I don't know if Scribeberry is already in big hospitals, but let's say Scribeberry gets into a huge hospital, and then you actually see from a hospital level how it improves, and that drives policy and drives change in other hospitals. Do you think that could be a potential, change or solution towards that crisis? And do you think that there's anything that's stopping, innovative companies like Scribeberry from having those massive impacts? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think of course, like I think that's what kind of motivates us, to be honest. It's kind of waking up and you see the tangible benefit that this tool brings, right? And as a company, you want to create more and do more and help. Sometimes you feel like you're fighting against the world because of all the kind of bureaucracy and policy and time to implementation, etc. But yeah, already we've kind of seen waves and smaller kind of waves in different groups, and whether it's OHTs, PCNs, some hospitals that want to adopt it, but have to go through the hurdles of adoption. So there's a lot of positivity there for sure. And we've had, people say this tool will single-handedly save family medicine. So getting feedback like that is very validating. But at the end of the day, I think on a system level, it's a concerted effort, right? You need everyone to kind of work in the same direction. And will we get that? I hope. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you hear a lot of talk, I think, internationally and even from a Canadian landscape about just governance of AI tools in general. I mean, what we're talking about with ambient health scribes is obviously not decision making for patients or choosing a drug or, doing something that can be invasive. How do you think tools like this should be governed? Like once regulation does come down, do you think they need governance? Are there things that bodies need to put into play to say like these are the minimum criteria you need as a scribe to really function?
Yeah.
Or do you think it's going to be a space where there isn't governance because it's just a tool that listens and writes a note without it giving any advice or any medical decision help?
I think 100% there has to be a level of governance. Um, there is, a level of governance right now. It's not all kind of organized and clear, but provincially, each province has their own kind of privacy laws, data laws, and you kind of have to comb through everything and then tailor your product to kind of meet all those criteria. 100% there has to be a level of just kind of policy present, but at the same time I think you can't stifle innovation as well, right? So there's that balance, like you have to kind of regulate but not kill innovation, and that's a really fine line, I think. You kind of see two examples I'll give you. One is the US and one is the EU. So opposite ends of kind of the spectrum in terms of regulation. I think the US is going to move towards more heavy regulation, just as you see the danger of AI in other spaces, military and whatnot. But so far, the US has been really free market. You've seen numerous solutions. You've seen implementation, everywhere. Um, Major hospital networks early on, before Canadian tools even became available. And then you see the EU, where we've had clinicians who want to use Scribeberry, but they can't because it's very restrictive in terms of what they can use and can do. So somewhere in between there's that fine line. We got to regulate and be safe, but not overdo it, right? And I think that's the best way to go about it. But I don't know. Every jurisdiction's different. How do you walk that tightrope? It's more like a political question. And yeah, it's hard to kind of gauge. There's so many factors that go into that.
Yeah. And so I guess, you mentioned a few of the regulations that are limiting you, for example, in places like UK. What are the worries you get when you talk to clinicians out there, like when you're talking about this product, whether it's family medicine, specialty clinics, hospitals, like what are people's fears around ambient health scribed, and what do you think the hesitation is that you're
Yeah,
seeing out there? And have you guys done some research around this?
yeah, definitely. So number one hesitation obviously is privacy, right? Like data privacy. I could talk through our product and kind of how we maintain privacy, and we don't have retention, we don't train our AI on inputs. Um, so and everything's encrypted. And data is ultimately at the control of the user or physician. With that being said, that's the number one issue. And hand in hand with that, it's kind of that early adoption fear. It's like, in medicine, you say don't be the first doctor to prescribe a new drug. It's kind of that same fear where, am I going to get sued? Is something going to come back at me? What's going to happen? Can this data leak? So those have been kind of the apprehensions. And then in that kind of layer, which we can very easily answer and go through the process, is what will my health authority or hospital or whoever think about this? And that's obviously, if you go to big clinics or hospitals, that sometimes is uh, where the holdup can be, right? In terms of doctors adopting it. I think that's the big barrier. Is yeah, just kind of that hesitation, early adoption, not really fully knowing, the data policies of the tool, um, and the fear generally, and rightfully so in some instances, around AI, right? Um, and how it's portrayed. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, I, so of course, there's right now, 2024, there's a lot of scribing tools out there. I think there's 50 something, right? If I'm correct, Samir.
Yeah, there's a lot.
And and I guess like you are the best person that to ask this question is, what do you think makes a scribing tool in the healthcare space better? And also, like, why do you think Scribeberry is better in that sense?
So obviously, full bias here and disclaimer, like obviously I run Scriber. But I'll speak generally first. In terms of what makes a good scribing tool, number one, easy onboarding, easy to use, familiar interface. The user experience and user interface has to be good, right? That's number one, because you're never going to get to doctors otherwise, right? We're pretty type A about our workflows. So that's number one. Number two, I think there has to be accuracy, customizability, and an understanding of a doctor's workflow. So a regular scribe company, let's say run by, tech guy A, might not understand all of those. So they might just have a record button and, you generate a note. But they might not have templates or the ability to customize that note, to chain it afterwards, to upload the doctor's own templates, to kind of have these differentiators that, you think are small, but in the grand scheme of things are massive, right? These are like 30-minute time sinks in a day. So it's those kind of little things, I think, that make a good scribe versus maybe a not so good scribe. With Scribeberry, we've just tried to kind of capture all of that. And development wise, we have a ton that we want to build out too. So one example of this is our tool called Ada. And what Ada is it actually is an AI that'll speak to the patient and get a history for the provider before the patient ever walks in. And it's adaptive. If the patient answers wrong or tries to trick Ada, it'll adapt, re-ask the question, change the topic. So that, imagine you're in a clinic and you have 4 exam rooms, and one patient has taken like 30 minutes when you thought it was 5-minute appointment. And now at least you have this history from Ada in the next 3 exam rooms. So you kind of know how to, quote unquote, fix your time or catch up for the rest of the day. So yeah, it's just these kind of small workflow integrations that I think are really key. Yeah.
I think that's a great kind of way of looking at the space in that like physicians are all about their workflow, and we're so married to how we do things, from the time we walk into the hospital or the clinic, and how we see patients, when we write our notes, how we even say certain things in our notes. Everyone has their own style of
Mm-hmm.
doing things. Multiple cardiologists have a different note template. Where I work in emergency medicine, when we use tools like Epic, a lot of physicians have templates for chest pain, abdominal pain, headache, and
Yeah.
each of those notes are different. So how do you see kind of that personalization taking place in, the ambient healthcare and scribe space? Is that something that you guys do a lot of? Is that something other companies do a lot of? And how important do you think that is when it comes to having a scribe?
Yeah. So I think we're one of the few companies that do that. We're the only company, to my knowledge, that does that in a way that doesn't train on user data. And so what we do is we let doctors kind of upload their own templates, their own notes. So they choose the data that gets put in. And it doesn't have to be a completed note with PHI. And essentially, we look at that note and it copies their structure and style, and then they can generate notes in the same format that they're used to. So that's what we've done from a customization piece. Other companies, some of them do, and most of them don't. But yeah, I think definitely, that's the route it's going to go. In terms of the future, I think the pace of AI acceleration is exponential, right? So right now we have AI scribes, but I guarantee you, and like maybe don't guarantee, but I'm sure at some point, there's going to be advanced tools, beyond the scribe. And who knows what that's going to look like, but a year or two, I don't think it's going to take that long before a lot of what we're doing is obsolete almost, and it's going to be even faster, better workflow. So that's kind of what we want to look towards too, is just constantly adapt and innovate and make sure we're building something sustainable and long term.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about Ada, I think the concept is really cool. When I work in an academic site, it's kind of like having a resident, who goes in and sees a patient for me and kind of does the whole history and the exam and comes back and says, here's what I got from the patient. The only thing different is the resident typically comes up with a plan, and
Yeah,
I would take it Ada doesn't do that. But as you're saying, the rate of adoption and growth is so quick in the space that potentially I would think at one point, if Ada has all the right information, you might be able to do something like
so
that, right?
so on that note, like right now Ada can do that. Like it can actually give you differentials, it can give you plans, but obviously for safety and regulatory reasons we're not going to let it. So that's kind of where where that aspect of that interplay between regulation, safety, um, and development really comes in, right? Like I think we're at a point where AI is already ahead of the regulatory framework, and I think it's going to accelerate at a pace that regulation is going to be forced to catch up. That's usually how it is. Technologies develop, regulation catches up, but I feel like this is one of those fields that it's going to be very apparent and very exponential, kind of like the advent of the internet, I feel. So yeah.
So one of the very interesting things that you touched upon is you guys don't train on user data. And a lot of, so I guess this is somewhat controversial in the sense
Mhm.
that there's researchers or there's experiments that show that training on user data doesn't make it more personalized, doesn't make better, does make it better for the user and does increase, let's say, accuracy for their specific task, right? Um, have you guys done experiments or like what's your general finding about that? Um, if you can share.
Yeah. So I obviously if you train on user data, it's going to be more specific to that user. I think for us, it's kind of balancing our privacy policies versus that benefit that you see from that. And for us right now, we feel it's more important to take that privacy and safety route rather than the incremental benefit you might see. Um, we have other kind of internal mechanisms to sort of modulate that and still use the user's input in their own templates and notes uh, with their discretion and in a different way, where it's not every live visit with their patient is being captured and then translated into improvements to their notes. And some provincial health laws are pretty clear. Like if you collect health data, it can only be used for like the primary purpose of which you're collecting it, right? Um, so I'm sure, like again, legal and regulatory frameworks will clarify this with time. But we've just chosen to take a safer route that way. Yeah.
Yeah, especially given that, as you said, that's one of the biggest concerns you hear from physicians when you speak to them is that of what happens to the data. So can you just, with Scribeberry specifically, walk us through? You said all the data
Yeah.
that goes in is completely de-identified, but like, what's the path of the data until the note? And then once the note is transcribed, is the data just dumped and gone right away? Or what does it actually look like?
So in terms of how it works, when the user presses record, uh, that audio is being live transcribed right away. Most of our competitors, probably all of them, use a third-party software of some kind. So they use Microsoft or Google, Cloud or Azure or something to transcribe that. We have our own, self-hosted self-hosted product that actually transcribes. Um, and in our backend, we have 16 GPUs kind of set up. I was telling Samir, our server is probably bigger than the UFA uh, in terms of what they use. And that's just for the capacity that we have of users. So that note gets transcribed, it's encrypted. We can't see that data. There's no audio file being created. It gets deleted with every chunk that's being transcribed, second by second. And then you have that data that's there, that's encrypted. It gets sent to our large language model, which we have a number of rules around that are proprietary, like when do we use what data or how do we access the LLM in a way that is that gets the best result. And in some instances maintains privacy. For example, if you're in Canada, it'll lock you to like a Canadian server. Whereas if you're in the US, it might open up things a little bit. But yeah, then it hits the large language model, it gets processed, it comes back to the user, and the note gets displayed. That process is encrypted. The note at rest is encrypted. We use the latest encryption standards. And then once that note is displayed, the user kind of controls what do we do with that data, right? So the doctor can keep that scribe, uh, or they could delete it right away. We find most users delete their scribes. Again, it's up to them, and there's no reason to, but some of them do keep it for like a week or two, and then do follow-up visits in that same scribe, or transfer that data at a later time. But that's kind of the journey of data, essentially. Yeah.
Awesome. And like, when we talk about LLMs, oftentimes, if I ask ChatGPT a question one way, it can answer it, completely different. Like, what's the variation you find? Like, if you were interviewing me as your patient, every time if we had the same conversation, would Scribeberry generate a note that's very similar, or is there a variation?
Yeah, so you can set those parameters with large language models, right? So you can set, it's called the temperature. You can set those, parameters to 1 where it'll like make up stuff and, elaborate, or you can set it to like nothing and it'll be like robotic. Um, so we've tried to strike a middle ground where there is variability, but it's accurate. Um, and early on, we actually got this as feedback where we would initially have notes that were very robotic and short. And people would complain, say, my notes are too short, they're missing details. And then we switched it and said, hey, now it's making up details and it's, too elaborate. And so over time, we've kind of fine-tuned that to a point where, okay, it's not going to hallucinate, it's accurate, but there is variability. I think we found that sweet spot, but obviously as things evolve and more users come on board and larger institutions, there's always going to be fine tuning and tailoring there. Um, and I think part of that goes back to AI models, right, and large language models. Essentially, they're next token predictions, right? And with the way they're set up, there's always going to be a degree of hallucination with any system. Obviously, you try to minimize it, and we've done a good job at that. But that's going to be inherent with any large language model. Yeah.
What do you find the rate of, like, if someone were to ask you, like, what percentage of times do you find that there'll be hallucinations? Like, are we talking like 1%, 2%, or
Yeah.
50%, for example? Like, how often do these hallucinations happen? Because I feel
As,
like that would be a common question.
yeah. So it is less than 1%, but a lot of it is user dependent. So that rate goes higher when you look at how users are using it. So for example, if let's say you use Scribeberry, but you send a prompt that says, summarize my exam findings, right? It's a very generic, general kind of prompt that could take that info and do it in so many different ways. Whereas if you're more specific in your ask, take this neuro exam and condense it into 2 lines, do not add any information. You're going to get a better result. So just like any other tool, I think there is an element of user dependence on it. That can skew that hallucination rate and the user experience as well. And so that's where a lot of our focus goes into is how do we maximize the user interface and their experience to avoid pitfalls like, hey, this thing's hallucinating, when in reality it might be something that's just because the education around the software wasn't there, or it's their first time, or yeah. So
Interesting. Do you find that people, once they start generating notes and using Scribeberry more often, that they're still looking at every note that's transcribed, reading it line by line to confirm that, there's no hallucinations and they agree with what was written? Or do you find that physicians get into this habit where they like see it works really well 10 times and then it's like you start the scribe, it's done, the note's done, and they don't actually read the whole note, they just move on to their
yeah,
next patient? And, and,
yeah.
and what would you recommend people
I
do?
mean, I recommend doctors always read their notes. Like, at the end of the day, we're liable for the notes we write, and Scribeberry is a tool, or any AI scribe. So obviously, always read it, check it, ensure it's correct. With that being said, I think workflow-wise, I think early on there's definitely that hesitation, but once doctors see kind of 9, 10 notes sort of come out in the way they want, um, they're more likely, I think, to skim over it as opposed to read every single line or every single word. But from our end, I would say definitely read through your notes and check everything, because that's a liability risk, and also you don't want to, mess up documentation from a patient safety perspective too. So,
Yeah, so just jumping sort of out of the scribing world a little bit,
mhm.
and then just to take some of your views on AI in healthcare. Um, so we actually do this very fun thing towards like the end of the podcast, in which we get your take on, what's the thing that you're most excited about in AI in healthcare in
Yeah,
this year? And then like what's the thing that you're most scared of? Like absolutely, if it happens, it's
yeah.
super scary. Well, what is it?
So I think like this year, I'm most excited for is being able to autofill forms and autocomplete tasks. Um, so I think like that's gonna be, pretty game changing. Like, you just upload a form and maybe in 2, 3 years, residents aren't gonna know the pain of like filling out like this 12-page disability document. Um, in terms of what I'm most scared of, honestly, it's like robot doctors. I think that's the big fear. Um, Robot doctors and in general with AI is just like robots that are going to be smarter than us in many ways, right? You see it with like what's that company? Figure Eight, I think, like the robot company OpenAI is invested in, and how
Mhm.
like you're talking to these robots like they're humans and they're already kind of putting dishes away and doing things. And then like intelligence wise, I know it's still just a next token prediction, but some LLMs, how like is there a degree of like consciousness or sentience, or like can we lose control of them? Kind of iRobot doomsday scenario stuff, but uh, yeah, I think that would be the fear. I don't know how rational it is, but I could see it like in some capacity, in healthcare as well, in terms of losing that human touch. So yeah,
So just a little bit more on that. I think what you were talking about robot, like AI robot doctors is
yeah,
very, it's interesting because in some way, right, Ada is
yeah,
doing that. It
yeah,
just doesn't
exactly.
have the physical body of like a robot, but it
Hmm.
is doing some sort of interaction with the physician directly, and it's conducting right now, it's probably like pre-planned, but I think there's a level of flexibility and freedom in its choice, right? If I'm correct.
Yeah,
Um,
correct.
and and if you think about it, AI doctor might not be in form of a robot
Yeah,
because practically speaking, like if there's like a you've seen those pods, right? Like
yep,
if a pod can take the X-ray scan or like ultrasound, and then it has like a decision making brain behind it, that could be your AI doctor. Um,
for sure.
do you think that's something that you would like to see in the next 3 or 5 years? Or do you think that we should probably not do that and just focus more on, you know, saving time for the human physicians that we have right now? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think, there's a part that just from a tech, like geeky point of view, I would love to see it. But when you take a step back and you look at like the implications of it all, are we heading in the right direction? I think it's a very like philosophical question because we're going to see a lot of good that comes from it, but good tools in the hands of bad actors with poor regulation, is a recipe for disaster. So
Mhm.
with ADA, if you have, right now, like we've safety gated it to like not diagnose, not treat, it could easily do that. And what happens then? um, and so I think it comes back to that balance between innovation and regulation. Um, I don't know, where that balance is. I'm excited. The tech part of me is like, hey, let's go full steam ahead, and then the
Mhm.
doctor part of me is like, okay, slow down. Um, this might not be safe, and probably people in different industries share that same feeling. Whether it's like military applications and or other applications. Yeah,
Yeah. I think it's more for healthcare just because of
yeah,
how it's structured and like how it's directly related to human lives.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, I,
I think, as a clinician, you probably see this all the time, right? Like medicine is an art, and you could have someone who has the best textbook knowledge. And sometimes you see this in training, like you work with residents that are really smart and they can give you 20 differentials on presentations, but like their people skills, their communication skills, those other parts of what really make a good physician and make patients feel comfortable and safe is missing. It's kind of like House MD in a way, if you watch that show, right? Like he's got all the differentials down, but the bedside manners is kind of off. And it's like,
Yeah,
where do you find that right balance? I'm with you in that, the knowledge base of an AI system is going to be very impressive. I mean, you and I both know after we write a Royal College exam, at some point in time, that knowledge retention starts to fall off, and we need tools like in clinical practice, whether it's up to date or whatever it is that you use to help
Mhm.
guide us to remember things. But it's like that human aspect of medicine, I think, is always something that's going to be so important. I mean, there are papers out there talking about the empathy of AI and sometimes how they're more empathetic than doctors, but I almost see tools like Scribeberry where you unburden a physician and give them that time back to rejuvenate, that it will make them better with those other non-medical skills. They'll be more relaxed. They'll be, they've had time at home with their kids to do things like play golf. So when they go into work, they're less rushed and more calm and have time to spend with patients and really be present. So one of the things I would be really excited about, and I am excited about, is like tools like Scribeberry really being proliferated, saving that pajama time to make clinicians feel better and have less burnout. Because I think that's going to really change a patient's experience at the end of the day. It's like hard to measure the ROI on those things and put it into cents and dollars, but I think those are things that really count, and I think patients really care about.
Yeah, I agree. I think, paradoxically too, like you briefly mentioned too, like, can an AI be more empathetic than a human? And I think we're like a UI and UX away from that, honestly. Like if you look at like GPT 4.0 and, the latest kind of launch of their like, voice to voice model, it's very similar to Ada. Honestly, like there's many people would probably talk to that for like 6 hours and then a psychologist for 1 hour once a week. You know what I mean? Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, who knows? Who knows where that's gonna go? But I mean, yeah, it's definitely interesting.
For sure. And before we end off, I mean, I think one question I really also wanted to ask you is, are there other AI tools you use as a physician, other tools you think that are out there that are kind of low-hanging fruits that you would recommend physicians think about and use to reduce, some of this administrative burden and issues that they're facing?
Yeah, I mean, I still definitely use ChatGPT. I use Claude. Um, there are a lot of cool tools out there. Um, but yeah, apart from that, like clinical practice, not too much. Um, I'm constantly just kind of like looking for new AI tools as well. I just go online and spend time on the internet looking for them. But um, yeah, so far, honestly, I've stuck to kind of ChatGPT and maybe Claude here and there, but that's about it. Apart from obviously Scribeberry.
Yeah, I mean, I had a great time with this conversation. I truly agree with you in that, these ambient AI scribes, they're making waves for a reason. And, the amazing work you guys are doing at Scribeberry, have certainly used the tool and find the interface very easy to use. I mean, you didn't chat about some of the other amazing features like the language translation real time that sometimes we struggle with in a clinical environment that these tools can do. And I think I'm very excited to see where it goes in the next 1, 3, 5 years, because I'm excited about the fact that we can get a lot of time back to do other things that make us feel better and allow us to give better patient care. So thank you for all the hard work you've done on Scribeberry, for joining us on the podcast, for your insights on AI and what you're excited about and what scares you. And keep up the good work, and we're really grateful that you could join us today. And we hope our listeners had a great time and that they would check out ambient AI scribes like Scribeberry to see how it impacts their workflow. And I think it's the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to actually using an AI tool in a clinical practice setting, to see a tangible change and something that you can do if you're a family doc, a specialist, whoever you are, you would have access to something like this. So really excited about the space. Loved having you on the podcast, and thanks so much for your time.